April 18, 1775, and the cobblestone streets of Boston lay shrouded in an uneasy darkness that seemed to press against every window and doorway. Paul Revere stood in the shadowed doorway of a silversmith's shop, his eyes scanning the distant silhouette of the Old North Church, where two lanterns would soon flicker to life and change the course of human history. The tension in the air was so thick that every colonist who passed through those streets could feel it settling on their shoulders like a physical weight, a premonition that the years of growing resentment between the American colonies and the British Crown were about to explode into something far more dangerous than angry words and boycotted tea. The relationship between Great Britain and her American colonies had been deteriorating steadily since the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. What had begun as a dispute over taxation without representation had evolved into something far more profound, a fundamental disagreement about the nature of liberty, governance, and the rights of free men. King George III and his Parliament in London viewed the colonies as extensions of British power, existing primarily to enrich the mother country through trade and taxation. The colonists, however, had developed their own identity during more than a century and a half of relative autonomy, and they increasingly saw themselves not as subjects to be exploited but as free Englishmen entitled to all the rights and liberties guaranteed by their heritage. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, had received intelligence that the colonial militia was stockpiling weapons and ammunition in the town of Concord, approximately 20 miles northwest of Boston. More concerning to the British command was the knowledge that Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two of the most vocal and influential leaders of the colonial resistance movement, were lodging in Lexington, directly along the route to Concord. Gage's orders were clear: march a force of British regulars under cover of darkness, arrest Adams and Hancock, and seize or destroy the military supplies in Concord before the rebels could mobilize an effective response. But the colonists had developed their own intelligence network, and word of the British plans had already spread through the intricate web of patriots who called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent physician and revolutionary leader, had received confirmation of the British movement and immediately dispatched riders to warn the countryside. Paul Revere and William Dawes were chosen for this critical mission, taking separate routes to ensure that at least one of them would reach Lexington with a warning. As Revere mounted his horse that night, he carried with him more than just a message of impending British military action. He carried the accumulated grievances of 13 colonies, the dreams of men who dared to imagine a government based on the consent of the governed, and the desperate hope that free people might resist tyranny without destroying themselves in the process. The night air was cold against his face as he spurred his horse forward, riding through the darkness toward a collision that neither he nor anyone else could fully comprehend. Behind him, approximately 700 British soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn were already forming ranks, their red coats appearing black in the pre-dawn darkness, their muskets loaded, their bayonets fixed, marching toward a confrontation that would echo through centuries. April 19, 1775, and the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the village green at Lexington, illuminating a scene that would be immortalized in American memory forever. Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War who now commanded the local militia, stood watching as approximately 70 of his men assembled on the triangular common that served as the heart of their small community. These were not professional soldiers but farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, ordinary men who had left their beds in the cold hours before sunrise because Paul Revere and William Dawes had ridden through their town shouting warnings that the British regulars were marching toward them with hostile intent. The previous hours had been chaotic and confusing. Revere and Dawes had successfully reached the home of Reverend Jonas Clark, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying. Shortly after midnight, the revolutionary leaders had been warned and were making preparations to flee to safety. But the question of what to do about the approaching British column remained unanswered. Should the militia confront them? Should they let them pass? Should they hide and observe? These were questions with profound implications, because everyone understood that any armed confrontation between colonists and British soldiers would transform the political crisis into something far more dangerous. Historical accounts from this period, as documented in numerous contemporary letters and journals preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, reveal the deep uncertainty that gripped the colonial leadership in those crucial hours. According to research compiled by historians who have studied the depositions taken immediately after the battle, Captain Parker had initially mustered his militia around 2 o'clock in the morning, but after waiting for hours with no sign of the British, he had dismissed most of his men to nearby Buckman Tavern with instructions to remain ready to reassemble at the beat of the drum. The militiamen were exhausted, cold, and increasingly skeptical that the British would actually march through their town, but the intelligence had been accurate. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's column of British regulars had indeed left Boston, though their departure had been delayed by logistical difficulties and the challenge of moving such a large force quietly through occupied territory. As they marched through the darkness, the British officers became increasingly aware that their supposedly secret mission had been compromised. Church bells rang in the distance, signal shots echoed across the countryside, and they occasionally spotted riders racing ahead of them, clearly carrying warnings to the towns that lay in their path. Major John Pitcairn, commanding the advance guard of light infantry, pushed his men forward as quickly as possible, hoping to reach Lexington before the local militia could organize an effective response. As the British column approached the town center just as dawn was breaking, they could see approximately 70 colonial militiamen assembled on the green, many of them still in the process of forming ranks. The sight must have seemed both pathetic and defiant to the British officers, who commanded a professional military force more than 10 times larger than this gathering of armed farmers. Captain Parker, seeing the overwhelming British force approaching with fixed bayonets, reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." These words, whether precisely accurate or not, captured the essence of the colonial dilemma. They were prepared to resist British tyranny, but they were not eager to fire the first shot and bear the moral responsibility for starting a war. As the British troops deployed from column into line, surrounding the green on 3 sides, the moment of decision approached with terrifying inevitability. April 19, 1775, and the dawn air at Lexington Green crackled with a tension so profound that men on both sides would later struggle to describe the exact sequence of events that followed. Major John Pitcairn rode forward toward the assembled colonists, his voice carrying across the common as he ordered the rebels to lay down their arms and disperse. Behind him, approximately 240 British light infantrymen stood in formation, their muskets held at the ready, their discipline holding despite the nervous energy that ran through their ranks like an electric current. The king's soldiers had trained for years to stand firm in the face of enemy fire, but this was different. These were not foreign enemies but fellow subjects of the crown, men who spoke the same language and claimed the same rights as freeborn Englishmen. Captain Parker, recognizing the futility of resistance against such overwhelming force, began ordering his militiamen to disperse. The accounts recorded in various depositions taken in the days following the battle, as preserved in collections like those at the Library of Congress, indicate that the colonists were indeed beginning to leave the green, though they were not laying down their weapons. Some were backing away slowly, others were turning toward their homes, and a few were standing their ground, unwilling to show submission to what they viewed as military tyranny. The situation was fluid, chaotic, and dangerously unpredictable. Then a shot rang out, a single musket discharged somewhere in that confused scene, and the sound seemed to freeze time itself for a heartbeat before unleashing chaos. To this day, historians debate who fired that first shot, whether it came from a British regular, a colonial militiaman, or perhaps someone watching from a nearby building. What is certain is that the shot broke whatever fragile restraint had been holding both sides back from violence. British officers shouted orders trying to maintain control, but their voices were drowned out by the sudden eruption of musket fire as redcoats along the British line began shooting into the dispersing colonists. The engagement, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 10 minutes. The colonial militia, caught in the open and vastly outnumbered, had no chance of mounting an effective defense. 8 militiamen fell dead or dying on the green. Jonathan Harrington, who crawled wounded to his doorstep and died in his wife's arms. Jonas Parker, Captain John Parker's cousin, who stood his ground and was bayoneted after his musket misfired. Caleb Harrington, Robert Munro, Isaac Muzzy, Samuel Hadley, and John Brownell fell that morning, their blood staining the ground where they had gathered to defend their community's rights. 10 more colonists suffered wounds, some of which would prove fatal in the days to come. As the smoke cleared and the British officers regained control of their troops, the magnitude of what had just occurred began to settle over everyone present. The British regulars had fired upon and killed colonial subjects who were attempting to disperse. The colonists had witnessed what they would immediately characterize as a massacre of peaceable citizens by a tyrannical military force. The political crisis that had been building for more than a decade had finally crossed the threshold into armed conflict, and there would be no walking it back. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's main column arrived at the green just as the shooting ended. The wounded were carried away, the dead were left where they fell, and the British force reorganized itself for the march to Concord. Some of the British officers were shaken by what had occurred, understanding that they had just participated in something that would have enormous political ramifications. Others viewed it as a necessary assertion of royal authority over rebellious subjects. But all of them knew that their mission was not complete, and they still had to march to Concord, seize the military supplies they had been sent to destroy, and then make the long march back to Boston through countryside that would now be fully aroused against them. April 19, 1775, and the British column pressed forward from Lexington toward Concord with grim determination. The morning sun now fully risen, and illuminating the road ahead in clear spring light. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith understood that his force had crossed a threshold that morning. But his orders remained unchanged. Proceed to Concord, locate and destroy the rebel military supplies, and return to Boston. The 6-mile march from Lexington to Concord took approximately 2 hours, and during that time the British soldiers could see evidence that the countryside was mobilizing against them. Riders raced along parallel roads. Church bells rang from every direction, and occasionally they spotted armed men watching them from distant hillsides. The town of Concord had received advance warning of the British approach hours earlier, thanks to the midnight rides of Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott, who had continued onward after the first two riders were detained by a British patrol near Lexington. This advance warning had given the colonists precious time to hide or remove most of their military supplies. Cannon were buried, muskets were distributed to surrounding towns, and gunpowder was concealed in locations the British would never think to search. When the British troops finally marched into Concord Center around 8 o'clock that morning, they found a town that appeared quiet and peaceful, though every inhabitant understood that appearances were deceiving. Colonel Smith established his command post at the town center and dispatched companies of light infantry to search for the reported weapons cache. Captain Lawrence Parsons led 7 companies of regulars toward Barrett's farm, approximately 2 miles north of town center, where intelligence suggested significant quantities of military supplies were hidden. As these troops crossed the North Bridge spanning the Concord River, they left 2 companies behind to hold the bridge and maintain their line of retreat. This decision would prove fateful, because while the British were searching Barrett's farm and finding disappointingly little contraband, colonial militia companies from surrounding towns were gathering on the hills overlooking Concord. The colonial response to the British march was remarkable in its speed and coordination, reflecting years of preparation and organization by the resistance movement. Militia companies from towns like Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and Carlisle converged on Concord, their numbers growing by the hour as riders spread word of the confrontation at Lexington Green. By mid-morning, approximately 400 colonial militiamen had assembled on Punkatasset Hill, overlooking both the town center and the North Bridge. These were not the same men who had faced the British at Lexington. They were fresh, organized, and increasingly angry as news spread of the deaths on Lexington Green. Colonel James Barrett, whose farm the British were currently searching, commanded the colonial forces gathering on the hill. He was a veteran military leader, 54 years old, and he understood both the opportunities and dangers of the situation developing before him. The British force in Concord was now divided, with companies scattered throughout the town conducting searches, 7 companies distant at his farm, and only 2 companies holding the critical North Bridge. As Barrett watched smoke rising from the town center where the British were burning gun carriages they had discovered, he made the decision that would transform this confrontation into a full-scale battle. From the historical accounts compiled in works such as those housed in the Concord Museum, which contains extensive documentation of the battle from both British and colonial perspectives, we know that Barrett ordered his militiamen to advance toward the town center, not to initiate combat but to prevent the British from destroying their town. The colonists marched in formation down the hill toward the North Bridge, their numbers and confidence growing with each step. The 2 companies of British regulars holding the bridge, approximately 95 soldiers, watched this advancing force with increasing alarm and sent urgent messages back to Colonel Smith requesting reinforcements. April 19, 1775, and the wooden planks of the old North Bridge groaned under the weight of historical destiny as approximately 400 colonial militiamen marched in formation down the hill toward the mere 95 British regulars who held the crossing. Captain Walter Laurie, commanding the British troops at the bridge, faced an impossible tactical situation. His men were outnumbered more than 4 to 1. Reinforcements were at least 15 minutes away, and his orders had been to hold the bridge at all costs. The colonists advancing toward him were no longer scattered farmers fleeing in panic like those at Lexington Green. They were organized military units, moving with discipline and clear tactical purpose. As the distance between the 2 forces narrowed, Captain Laurie ordered his men to tear up the bridge planks, hoping to create an obstacle that might delay the colonial advance. But there was insufficient time, and his soldiers had barely begun the work when the leading edge of the colonial force came within musket range. Major John Buttrick of Concord, who commanded the advance guard of the militia column, called out questions to the British about why they were destroying the bridge, but in the confusion and noise, communication broke down completely. What happened next would be debated for generations, but the essential facts were clear. The British regulars fired a volley into the advancing colonists, killing 2 men instantly and wounding several others. The colonial response was immediate and devastating. Major Buttrick, seeing his men fall, shouted the order that would echo through history: "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" The militia companies unleashed a disciplined volley directly into the massed British formation on the bridge. Unlike the chaotic engagement at Lexington Green, this was a proper military exchange between formed bodies of troops, and the colonists had every advantage. Their superior numbers, better positions, and the moral clarity of defending their own town against invasion all combined to produce a result that shocked both sides. The British line recoiled under the colonial fire. Officers fell wounded, including 4 lieutenants who were shot in rapid succession. Soldiers stumbled backward in confusion, their training and discipline suddenly inadequate against the unexpected ferocity of colonial resistance. The return fire from the British was sporadic and ineffective, hampered by their poor tactical position and the shock of facing determined opposition rather than fleeing militia. Within minutes, the British formation at the bridge had completely broken, with soldiers retreating in disorder back toward Concord Center, leaving their dead and wounded behind in their panic to escape. This moment at the North Bridge represented something fundamentally different from the encounter at Lexington Green. At Lexington, colonial militiamen had been shot down while attempting to disperse, creating an image of British aggression against peaceful citizens. At Concord's North Bridge, colonial forces had stood their ground, engaged British regulars in open combat, and forced them to retreat in disorder. This was not a massacre or a skirmish, this was a battle, and the colonists had won it decisively. The psychological impact of this engagement on both sides cannot be overstated. The British soldiers, who had been trained to view colonial militiamen as poorly organized rabble, had just been driven from the field by those same militiamen. The colonists, who had harbored deep uncertainties about whether they could stand against professional British troops, had just proven to themselves and the world that they could fight and win. As the British troops who had been searching Barrett's farm heard the sound of sustained musket fire from the direction of the bridge, they began hurrying back toward Concord Center, no longer concerned with finding hidden weapons but with rejoining their main force before they were cut off. Captain Parsons led his companies back toward the bridge, where they found the gruesome evidence of the fight: dead British soldiers lying on the ground, wounded men crying for help, and no sign of the colonists who had inflicted this defeat. The sight shook even veteran soldiers, many of whom had fought in previous wars but who were unprepared for combat against fellow subjects of the Crown on what they had believed was a routine security operation. April 19, 1775, and Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith stood in Concord Center facing a tactical nightmare that his training had not prepared him to solve. His force had been divided, engaged, and now needed to make a fighting retreat through approximately 18 miles of hostile countryside back to the safety of Boston. The original plan: a swift night march, quick seizure of military supplies, and return before the colonists could organize, had collapsed completely. It was now noon. His soldiers were exhausted from marching through the night and fighting through the morning, and the countryside around them was filling with armed colonists whose numbers grew with every passing hour. The British column began its retreat from Concord around noon, moving in formation back along the same road they had traveled that morning. But everything had changed. The colonial militia companies that had fought at the North Bridge were now shadowing the British withdrawal, and they were being joined by fresh militia units arriving from towns throughout Massachusetts. The colonists had quickly adapted their tactics to exploit the British Army's vulnerabilities. Rather than forming up for conventional battles where British discipline and training would give them advantages, the militia used the terrain to their benefit, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and buildings, then falling back before the British could bring their superior numbers to bear. The first ambush came at Miriam's Corner, where the road from Concord crossed a small bridge. Militia companies from Reading and Billerica had positioned themselves on high ground overlooking this natural choke point. As the British column compressed across the narrow bridge, the colonists opened fire, killing several soldiers and throwing the rear of the column into confusion. The British regulars attempted to return fire and execute flanking movements to drive off their attackers, but by the time they had organized a response, the militiamen had already withdrawn to new positions further down the road. This pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the next several hours, creating what British soldiers would later describe as the most harrowing military experience of their lives. The running battle that developed along the road from Concord to Lexington was unlike anything that had occurred in European warfare. The British troops, trained to fight in formal battles with clear lines of engagement, found themselves under constant fire from enemies they could rarely see. Colonial militiamen used every feature of the landscape to their advantage, firing from windows, from behind fence posts, from clusters of trees, and then melting away before British flanking parties could engage them. The British soldiers, burdened with heavy packs and ammunition, found themselves unable to catch or effectively counter these tactics. Their return fire was often wild and ineffective, wasting precious ammunition on empty woods, while their actual attackers repositioned for the next ambush. At Bloody Angle, a sharp curve in the road, surrounded by high ground and thick forest, the colonial fire became particularly intense. British soldiers fell by the dozens, shot down by militiamen they never saw. Officers who attempted to rally their men or organize counterattacks became priority targets for colonial marksmen. The psychological toll on the British soldiers was enormous. These were men trained to stand in formation and exchange volleys with enemy troops they could see and engage. But now they were being hunted through unfamiliar countryside by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Discipline began to fray, with some soldiers breaking ranks to seek cover or to flee ahead of the column in panic. Lieutenant Colonel Smith himself was wounded during this running fight, shot in the leg, and command increasingly fell to Major John Pitcairn, who worked desperately to maintain some semblance of order in the retreating column. The British soldiers were running low on ammunition, their formations were becoming ragged, and the number of wounded was growing to the point where the column could barely transport them. By the time the exhausted British force reached Lexington around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they were on the verge of complete collapse. Soldiers were ignoring officers' orders, breaking into houses to search for colonists to kill in revenge, and in some cases simply sitting down by the roadside in exhausted despair. If fresh help had not arrived at that exact moment, it is entirely possible that the entire British force would have been captured or destroyed. April 19, 1775, and the appearance of Lord Hugh Percy's relief column at Lexington must have seemed like deliverance. From heaven to the exhausted and bloodied soldiers of Smith's command, Percy had marched from Boston that morning with approximately 1,000 British regulars and 2 artillery pieces. Responding to urgent messages from Lieutenant Colonel Smith requesting reinforcements, the sound of cannon fire from Percy's artillery drove back the swarming colonial militiamen and gave Smith's battered troops their first respite since leaving Concord hours earlier. The British soldiers collapsed on Lexington Green, the same ground where they had shot down colonial militiamen that morning, drinking water, treating their wounded, and redistributing what little ammunition remained. Lord Percy, a 30-year-old brigadier general from one of England's most prominent noble families, surveyed the scene before him with growing understanding of how seriously the situation had deteriorated. The men of Smith's command were not merely tired, they were traumatized. Their uniforms torn and bloodied, their eyes showing the strain of hours of combat against an enemy they could not see or effectively fight. Percy's fresh troops provided not just numbers but also organization and, critically, the 2 6-pound cannon that gave the British force a significant tactical advantage. Colonial militia could harass infantry from concealed positions, but they would not readily approach artillery that could blast through their cover with grapeshot. After a brief rest, Percy organized a combined British force of approximately 1,700 men for the continued retreat to Boston. He placed Smith's exhausted soldiers in the center of the column where they could be protected, positioned his own fresh troops on the flanks and as advance and rear guards, and most importantly, assigned light infantry companies to sweep the ground on both sides of the road, attempting to deny the colonial militia the close-range positions they had used so effectively earlier. The column resumed its march toward Boston around 3:30 in the afternoon, and almost immediately the fighting resumed with renewed intensity. The colonial forces harassing the British retreat had continued to grow throughout the afternoon as militia companies from increasingly distant towns arrived to join the fight. By late afternoon, as many as 3,000 colonial militiamen were participating in the running battle, attacking the British column from all sides and pressing particularly hard on the rearguard. Percy's tactical adjustments made the British force more resilient, but they could not prevent the steady drain of casualties. The 2 artillery pieces proved their value repeatedly, with blasts of grapeshot clearing threatening positions and causing colonial militiamen to maintain greater respect for the British column's defensive perimeter. The character of the fighting during Percy's retreat differed from the earlier chaos along the road from Concord. The British force moved more deliberately, with better coordination between units, and they were more willing to take the time to properly clear dangerous positions before advancing. This slower pace actually worked to their advantage in some ways, as it allowed them to maintain better formation, discipline, and avoid the scattered desperation that had characterized the earlier retreat. However, the slower movement also meant that the colonial forces had more time to position themselves ahead of the British column, setting up ambush positions at every natural choke point and difficult terrain feature along the route. As the afternoon turned to evening, the British column passed through Menotomy, present-day Arlington, where the fighting reached its peak intensity. The town's inhabitants and surrounding militia units contested virtually every house and stone wall. British flanking parties broke into houses, searching for snipers and in some cases killing civilians who were armed or suspected of firing on the troops. The colonists responded with equally fierce determination, turning the town into a battle zone where neither side gave quarter. More British soldiers died in Menotomy than at any other point during the day's fighting, and several colonial militiamen were killed or wounded in close-quarters exchanges. The savagery of the fighting in this small Massachusetts town reflected the transformation of a political dispute into a genuine war, where old certainties about shared identity and common cause had been shattered by violence and blood. April 19, 1775, and the spring twilight was deepening into darkness as Lord Percy's battered column struggled through the final miles toward the safety of British-controlled Charlestown. The soldiers had been marching and fighting for nearly 20 hours, many without food or water, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The colonial militia continued pressing their attacks, even as darkness fell, firing from the shadows at the red-coated figures struggling along the road. Every soldier in that column understood that they were in a race against complete collapse. If the colonists could maintain pressure for just a few more hours, or if Percy had miscalculated the route or distance to safety, the entire force might be overwhelmed. The British commander made a crucial decision as his column approached Cambridge. The most direct route to Boston would have taken them through Cambridge Center, but Percy had received intelligence that colonial forces had destroyed the bridge over the Charles River and were waiting in strength to contest that crossing. Instead, Percy ordered the column to turn north toward Charlestown Neck, a longer route but one that led to a peninsula held by British forces with artillery support from Royal Navy ships in the harbor. This decision likely saved the British force from complete disaster, though it meant additional miles of marching for already exhausted troops. The fighting continued all the way to Charlestown Neck, though it diminished somewhat as darkness made accurate fire increasingly difficult for both sides. Colonial militiamen who had been pursuing the British all day were themselves exhausted, low on ammunition, and operating in unfamiliar territory as they moved closer to British-controlled Boston. The pursuit finally ended when the British column reached the protective perimeter around Charlestown, where fresh troops and artillery awaited them. The colonial forces withdrew as the British soldiers staggered into safety, collapsing where they stood, many too exhausted even to properly stack their weapons or attend to their wounded comrades. The butcher's bill for April 19th was shocking to both sides. The British had suffered 273 casualties, 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, most of whom would be confirmed as captured or killed in the following days. These were devastating losses for what was supposed to have been a routine security operation, representing approximately 15% of the entire force that had marched from Boston. The officer corps had been particularly hard hit, with several killed or seriously wounded, including Major John Pitcairn, who had survived the day but whose son had been wounded in the fighting. Colonial casualties were significantly lower, reflecting the tactical advantages they had enjoyed throughout most of the day's fighting. 49 militiamen were confirmed killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. However, these numbers did not tell the complete story of the day's impact. The colonists had mobilized thousands of militiamen from towns throughout Massachusetts, demonstrating an organizational capacity and willingness to fight that surprised British commanders. More importantly, they had proven to themselves and to the world that they could stand against British regular troops, inflict serious casualties, and force the retreat of a major British military operation. As news of the battle spread throughout the colonies in the days and weeks following April 19th, the political implications became clear. The bloodshed at Lexington and Concord had crossed a threshold from which there would be no easy return. Colonial moderates who had hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain found their positions undermined by British military aggression on American soil. British officials who had believed that a show of force would cow the colonists into submission had instead provoked exactly the widespread resistance they had hoped to prevent. The battle had also revealed the fundamental tactical and strategic challenges that would characterize the war to come. British forces controlled the cities and could win conventional battles, but they could not control the countryside or suppress a determined resistance movement spread across thousands of square miles of territory. In London, when news of Lexington and Concord finally arrived weeks later, the reaction was mixed. Some officials recognized that the situation in America had spiraled beyond the point where military force alone could resolve the crisis. Others doubled down on coercive measures, arguing that the colonists must be taught a harsh lesson about the consequences of rebellion. King George III, according to historical records preserved in the British National Archives, was firmly in the latter camp, declaring that the die is now cast and that the colonies must either submit or be subdued by force. This royal determination to prosecute the war vigorously would shape British policy for years to come. April 20th, 1775, and the dawn revealed a transformed political and military landscape in Massachusetts. The British forces that had staggered back to Boston during the night now found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Colonial militia companies that had fought along the road from Concord were not dispersing to their homes but instead were taking up positions in the hills and towns surrounding Boston. What began as a spontaneous military response to British aggression was rapidly evolving into an organized siege of the city, as militia commanders recognized that they had the British garrison trapped on a peninsula with limited supplies and no secure overland routes for reinforcement or withdrawal. General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief and royal governor of Massachusetts, faced a strategic nightmare. His garrison in Boston numbered approximately 5,000 soldiers, but they were now surrounded by a growing colonial army that might number 20,000 or more if the militia from throughout New England continued to arrive. The British controlled the sea approaches to Boston thanks to the Royal Navy's presence in the harbor, which meant they could be supplied and reinforced by ship, but they had lost control of the surrounding countryside and all the resources it contained. Worse, from Gage's perspective, was the political reality that the violence at Lexington and Concord had united colonial opinion against British policy in a way that years of political maneuvering had failed to achieve. The Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, the extra-legal revolutionary government that had been organizing colonial resistance, moved quickly to consolidate control and present the conflict in the most favorable light possible. They gathered depositions from participants in the battle, carefully documenting British aggression and colonial restraint. According to these depositions, preserved in various historical archives, including the Massachusetts State Archives, the colonial narrative emphasized that the British had fired first at Lexington, that they had killed men who were attempting to disperse peacefully, and that subsequent colonial military action had been purely defensive in nature. This narrative would prove crucial in gaining support from other colonies and eventually from foreign powers. The physical reality of the siege took shape rapidly. Colonial forces established camps in Cambridge, which became the headquarters of what would soon be recognized as a Continental Army. Other positions were established in Roxbury, Dorchester, and eventually on Charlestown Peninsula. These were not professional military encampments but rather improvised arrangements where militia companies from different towns tried to coordinate their efforts despite having no unified command structure, limited supplies, and no clear legal authority. The men in these camps were farmers and craftsmen who had left their homes in response to an emergency, and many assumed they would return to their normal lives once the immediate crisis passed. Few understood that they were at the beginning of a war that would last 8 years and transform 13 colonies into a new nation. The daily life of both the besiegers and the besieged settled into uneasy routines. British soldiers in Boston found themselves confined to the city, forbidden from leaving the peninsula except in organized military formations. They faced shortages of fresh food as the productive countryside that had supplied the city was now controlled by hostile forces. Colonial militiamen in the camps surrounding Boston faced different challenges: inadequate shelter, limited supplies of ammunition and powder, and the constant difficulty of maintaining discipline among men who were not professional soldiers and who had conflicting ideas about military hierarchy and authority. Illness began to spread through the crowded camps, and the question of how to sustain this military effort beyond the immediate crisis remained largely unanswered. Political developments moved rapidly in the weeks following Lexington and Concord. The Second Continental Congress, which had been scheduled to convene in Philadelphia in May, took on new urgency as delegates from throughout the colonies gathered to coordinate their response to what was now unmistakably an armed conflict with Great Britain. The New England delegates arrived with detailed accounts of the battles and urgent requests for support from other colonies. The question facing the Congress was no longer whether to resist British policy, but how to organize and sustain that resistance, how to create a unified military command from the various colonial militia forces, and how to navigate the perilous path between military resistance and an outright declaration of independence that would burn all bridges to reconciliation. May 10, 1775, and the Second Continental Congress convened in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. Gathering delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia would send delegates later to grapple with a crisis that had exploded beyond anyone's worst fears. The delegates who assembled in that building included many of the most prominent political figures in colonial America: John Adams and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, George Washington and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, John Jay from New York, and dozens of others whose names would become permanently associated with the American founding. They faced questions that had no clear precedents and no easy answers. The immediate military situation in Massachusetts demanded attention. The army of militia besieging Boston needed supplies, organization, and most critically, some form of unified command structure. John Adams emerged as the leading advocate for transforming what was essentially a Massachusetts militia force into a truly continental army that would represent all the colonies. This proposal faced significant obstacles, as many delegates were reluctant to take actions that might appear to embrace full-scale rebellion against the crown. However, the logic of military necessity ultimately prevailed. If the colonies were going to resist British military force, they needed an army, and if they were going to have an army, it needed leadership and organization that transcended individual colonial boundaries. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress made one of its most consequential decisions when it appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of what was now officially designated the Continental Army. Washington was not the most obvious choice for this position. Several generals with more extensive military experience were available. However, Washington brought critical advantages. He was from Virginia, the largest and most populous colony, which helped ensure Southern support for what had been primarily a New England conflict. He had significant military experience from the French and Indian War. He possessed the dignity, bearing, and personal character that inspired confidence. And perhaps most importantly, he was willing to serve without pay, taking only reimbursement for expenses, which demonstrated a commitment to service over personal gain that resonated with Republican values. Washington arrived in Cambridge on July 3, 1775 to take command of the Continental Army. What he found was simultaneously inspiring and deeply troubling. The militiamen who had rushed to Boston after Lexington and Concord had maintained the siege for more than 2 months, demonstrating a commitment and endurance that exceeded what most observers had expected. However, their organization was chaotic, supplies were inadequate, discipline was haphazard, and the various colonial units operated with wildly different standards and expectations. Washington immediately set about transforming this militia force into a proper army, instituting systematic drill and discipline, establishing clear chains of command, and working to secure the supplies and support that would be needed for sustained military operations. The military situation around Boston remained stalemated but tense. The British garrison, now reinforced by CN commanded by 3 Major Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, who had arrived in late May to assist General Gage, was determined to break out of the city and reassert British control. The colonial forces surrounding Boston were equally determined to maintain the siege and prevent any British advance into the countryside. This mutual determination led to the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, where colonial forces constructed fortifications on Charlestown Heights overlooking Boston, and the British launched a frontal assault to dislodge them. The resulting battle, though technically a British tactical victory, cost the British more than 1,000 casualties out of approximately 2,300 engaged, while colonial casualties numbered around 450. The battle demonstrated both that colonial forces could construct proper military works and defend them with determination, and that British willingness to take casualties in frontal assaults had limits. As summer turned to fall in 1775, the character of the conflict continued to evolve. What had begun as a spontaneous military response to British aggression at Lexington and Concord was becoming an organized war effort requiring systematic planning, resource allocation, and political coordination across 13 different colonies with different interests and priorities. The Continental Congress struggled with questions of taxation and finance, military organization and command, diplomacy and alliance, and perhaps most fundamentally, what their ultimate objectives were in this conflict. Some delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain under modified terms that would respect colonial rights. Others had already concluded that independence was the only acceptable outcome. These tensions would dominate American political discourse for the next year, until events and logic would finally drive the colonies toward the decisive step of declaring independence. Throughout the remainder of 1775 and into 1776, the conflict that had erupted at Lexington and Concord spread geographically and intensified in character. British forces in Boston remained besieged but secure, supplied by the Royal Navy and awaiting orders and reinforcements from London. The Continental Army under Washington maintained the siege while struggling with the perpetual challenges of supply, recruitment, and organization. But the war was no longer confined to Massachusetts. Fighting erupted in other colonies as royal governments attempted to assert authority and patriot forces moved to seize control of military assets and political institutions. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people who would escape their patriot masters and join British forces. This was primarily a military measure designed to disrupt the colonial economy and create internal security problems for the rebellion. But it had profound implications. It demonstrated British willingness to strike at the institution of slavery when doing so served military purposes. It created deep anxieties among Southern slaveholders about the revolutionary movement's implications for their labor system, and it highlighted the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American revolutionary cosmon claiming liberty for themselves while denying it to others. Thousands of enslaved people would eventually seek freedom behind British lines during the war, though their fate would vary dramatically depending on circumstances. The military situation in Boston finally reached a climax in March 1776, when Washington executed a brilliant strategic maneuver. Colonial forces, under the direction of General Henry Knox, had laboriously transported dozens of cannon from captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, dragging them 300 miles through winter conditions to Cambridge. On the night of March 4th, Washington's forces fortified Dorchester Heights, a position that commanded both Boston and its harbor. When British General William Howe, who had replaced Gage as commander, awoke to find American artillery positioned where it could bombard both his forces and the Royal Navy ships in the harbor, he recognized that Boston had become untenable. Rather than assault the fortified heights at great cost, Howe chose to evacuate the city entirely. The British evacuation of Boston in mid-March 1776 marked a significant psychological and propaganda victory for the Continental Army. The city that had been the flashpoint of colonial resistance for years, that had been occupied by British forces since 1774, and that had been under siege since immediately after Lexington and Concord, was now back in American hands without a major battle. British forces, along with approximately 1,000 loyalist civilians who feared retribution if they remained, sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia, conceding control of New England to the revolutionaries. This evacuation allowed the Continental Army to claim a significant success and demonstrated that British forces could be compelled to withdraw from American territory. However, the British evacuation of Boston was a strategic repositioning rather than a defeat. British strategy was evolving toward a recognition that New England was too heavily committed to the rebellion to be easily subdued, and that British efforts should focus on the middle colonies where loyalist sentiment was stronger and where control of major ports like New York would allow the Royal Navy to project power effectively. Through the spring and early summer of 1776, the British assembled a massive military force to execute this strategy. Hundreds of transport ships carrying approximately 32,000 soldiers, including thousands of German mercenaries hired from various German principalities, converged on New York Harbor in the largest amphibious military operation attempted to that date. As these military developments unfolded, political sentiment in the Continental Congress was shifting decisively toward independence. The publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense in January 1776 had a dramatic impact on public opinion, crystallizing arguments for complete separation from Great Britain in language that ordinary colonists could understand and embrace. The continued British military operations, the hiring of foreign mercenaries to fight against fellow subjects, and the King's proclamation in August 1775 declaring the colonies to be an open rebellion all contributed to a growing sense that reconciliation was impossible and that independence was the only logical course. On July 4, 1776, slightly more than 15 months after the shots at Lexington Green, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, formally announcing to the world that 13 colonies were now independent states united in a common cause. The battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, lasted only a day, but their consequences reverberated through centuries of American and world history. That single day of violence transformed a political dispute into a war. converted 13 separate colonial resistance movements into a unified revolutionary cause, and set in motion events that would ultimately create a new nation founded on principles that challenged the fundamental assumptions of 18th-century political order. Understanding why these particular battles had such profound consequences requires examining both the immediate circumstances and the deeper historical forces at work. The immediate military results of April 19th were significant, but not decisive. The British had failed to capture Adams and Hancock, had destroyed only a small portion of the military supplies at Concord, and had suffered embarrassing casualties in a retreat that revealed serious tactical and strategic vulnerabilities. The colonists had demonstrated their willingness and ability to fight, had inflicted significant casualties on professional British troops, and had successfully mobilized thousands of militiamen in a remarkably short time. But neither side had achieved anything resembling a decisive military victory, and many observers on both sides initially believed the conflict might still be contained or resolved through negotiation. What made Lexington and Concord historically decisive was not the military outcome, but the political and psychological impact. For the colonists, the battles provided clear evidence that British officials were willing to use military force to suppress colonial liberties. The sight of British soldiers shooting down militiamen on Lexington Green, regardless of who actually fired first, created a powerful narrative of British aggression that unified colonial opinion in a way that years of pamphlets and resolutions had failed to achieve. The successful resistance at Concord's North Bridge and the punishing running battle back to Boston demonstrated that British military power was not invincible, and that colonists could effectively resist even when facing professional troops. For the British, Lexington and Concord represented a catastrophic failure of strategy and policy. British officials had believed that colonial resistance was the work of a small minority of agitators, that most colonists remained loyal to the crown, and that a show of military force would intimidate the resistance movement into collapse. The battles demonstrated that all these assumptions were false. Colonial resistance was broad-based and deeply rooted. Colonial militiamen would fight rather than submit, and military force, rather than intimidating the colonists, was instead provoking them into unified opposition. These realities would shape British strategy throughout the war, as commanders struggled to identify and support loyalist populations, avoid actions that would inflame colonial opinion, and find military solutions to what was ultimately a political crisis. The battles also revealed fundamental differences in military culture and capability that would characterize the entire Revolutionary War. British forces were trained and organized for conventional European warfare, where disciplined formations exchanged volleys in open fields and where battles were discrete events with clear beginnings and endings. American militiamen, lacking formal military training but possessing intimate knowledge of local terrain and considerable experience with firearms, developed tactics that exploited British vulnerabilities, using cover and concealment, maintaining flexibility in organization, and blurring the lines between soldier and civilian in ways that frustrated British efforts to bring decisive force to bear. These differences would persist throughout the war, with British forces generally winning conventional battles but struggling to control territory or suppress resistance. The longer-term historical significance of Lexington and Concord extends beyond the American Revolution itself. The battles established a narrative of citizen soldiers rising up to defend their liberties against tyrannical power, a narrative that would become central to American national identity and that would inspire revolutionary and independence movements around the world. The image of farmers and craftsmen setting aside their tools to take up arms in defense of freedom became a powerful symbol that transcended the specific circumstances of 18th-century Massachusetts. This narrative, like all historical narratives, simplified a complex reality. It erased the experiences of loyalists who opposed the revolution, minimized the role of enslaved people whose liberty was not considered, and overlooked the ways that the revolution itself would create new forms of inequality and exclusion. Nevertheless, the core idea that people had a right to resist tyrannical authority through force if necessary, and that ordinary citizens could organize to defend their liberties, had profound implications for political thought and practice. The physical sites of the battles at Lexington and Concord have been preserved and commemorated as sacred ground in American memory. Minuteman National Historical Park protects much of the battle road between Lexington and Concord, allowing visitors to walk the same routes that British soldiers and colonial militiamen traveled on April 19, 17th. Lexington Battle Green preserves the site where the first shots were fired, with monuments to the militiamen who fell there. The Old North Bridge in Concord, reconstructed on its original site, marks the place where colonial forces first forced British regulars to retreat. These physical places serve as tangible connections to events that might otherwise seem distant and abstract, allowing each generation to engage with the questions and choices that their ancestors faced. As we reflect on Lexington and Concord from the vantage point of the 21st century, we can recognize both the extraordinary courage of those who fought there and the limitations and contradictions of their cause. They fought for liberty and self-government, principles that remain foundational to democratic societies. But they did so in a society that accepted slavery and denied political rights to women and non-property holders. They resisted what they saw as tyranny, but their resistance would create new forms of power that could themselves become oppressive. They began a revolution that proclaimed universal human rights, but the expansion of those rights to all people would require centuries of additional struggle. Understanding this complexity does not diminish the significance of April 19, 1775, but rather helps us appreciate the ongoing work of creating societies that actually live up to the ideals that were proclaimed, however imperfectly, when those first shots were fired at Lexington Green on a cold spring morning almost 250 years ago.